Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope that you're doing well. I hope you're having a great week. I finished reading Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom by William and Ellen Craft, and their narrative is utterly compelling. Every slave narrative we have from that has come down through history is integral to our understanding of just what a dehumanizing horror slavery was. That it was not a peculiar institution, a euphemistic term that Craft himself uses with absolute scorn within his narrative. But the Craft's narrative is particularly compelling. It's compelling for two reasons. One is the nature of their escape. It was unprecedented. It was really quite extraordinary what they achieved and how they went about achieving their escape from bondage. But the second is that this narrative, published in 1860, though their escape had occurred in 1848, this narrative serves as an incredible counterpoint in its own time to myths that have perpetuated, 160 years later. A lot of people who haven't really studied U.S. history carefully kind of have this idea, and there's this myth that the U.S. was drifting towards manumission, that eventually slavery would have ended and things would have gotten better for all of the human beings who were slaves. And that's not really accurate. There's a lot of ways in which slavery was never really quite as entrenched in the U.S. as it was in the 10 years before the U.S. Civil War, during which slavery ended. And in fact, there was a point at which a constitutional amendment had been proposed to permanently put slavery in the Constitution. Thankfully, we had an amendment, a few years later that did the complete opposite of that, thankfully. But this narrative really goes into specific detail around measures that were taken, legal measures, judicial measures, social and governmental measures that were being taken to really codify slavery and reinforce it and make sure that it would be perpetual. And it's really quite horrifying. But let's get into their narrative because it's fascinating. My wife and myself were born in different towns in the state of Georgia, which is one of the principal slave states. It is true our condition as slaves was not by any means the worst, but the mere idea that we were held as chattels and deprived of all legal rights, the thought that we had to give up our hard earnings to a tyrant to enable him to live in idleness and luxury, the thought that we could not call the bones and sinews that God gave us our own, but above all, the fact that another man had the power to tear from our cradle the newborn babe and sell it in the shambles like a brute, and then scourge us if we dared to lift a finger to save it from such a fate, haunted us for years. But in December 1848, a plan suggested itself that proved quite successful. And in 8 days, after it was first thought of, we were free from the horrible trammels of slavery, rejoicing and praising God in the glorious sunshine of liberty. Well, how did they achieve that escape? What was their plan? Well, the very next paragraph tells us the key. My wife's first master was her father, and her mother his slave, and the latter is still the slave of his widow. And this was a common practice in slavery, was that men would assault and rape their slaves and have children by them, who would then be treated as slaves. And this is a picture of Ellen Craft. And because she was lighter skinned, their escape involved the two of them over a period of about a week going out on just to different places and buying single garments, single components, a pair of spectacles at one point, tinted spectacles, a hat, a coat, different things, so that the night before their escape, William Craft cut his wife's hair, gave her a man's haircut. They dressed her up in the clothes, put like a bandage on her cheeks so that she wouldn't have to talk, put a bandage on her hand so that she wouldn't have to write or sign anything in a hotel, and they proceeded to escape from central Georgia, Macon, Georgia, to Savannah, then up to Charleston, and then up to Richmond, ultimately to Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and then eventually into Philadelphia. And they hit Wilmington on there as well. Traveling by rail, traveling by steamship, in public, with Ellen Craft posing as a white man, slave owner, and her husband William posing as the slave of this slave owner. There are all of these different junctures where she, of course, has to not only pass as white, but pass as a man and pass as a slave owner. And they managed to achieve that. They managed to escape in a way that really, as I said, it was unprecedented. Nobody had ever thought that, a pair of slaves would do this. people who couldn't write their names, who couldn't really quite read. They understood sort of characters within the alphabet, but they couldn't really write properly. And so the bandage on her hand, she wouldn't have to sign her name. The bandage on her cheek, she wouldn't have to talk very much. She could just kind of reply, in monosyllabics and then, say, I need to rest and things. And so their whole journey is a really interesting moment. Now, thankfully, we as readers know they have escaped. They are safe. They're actually writing this narrative from England 12 years later, where they're safe and they cannot be forced back into slavery, as the Fugitive Slave Act had allowed in the U.S. So we know that they achieved this escape, but at so many junctures, we're waiting for them to be caught. We're waiting for them to be exposed. We're waiting for them to suddenly have to make that run of 1,000 miles for freedom. And in reality, they managed to do it by steamship, by bus, by all of these modes in which they were out in public. And so it really is an extraordinary journey that's within this narrative. But as I mentioned, one of the things the other part of the narrative that is so compelling is the ways in which William Craft, with his wife Ellen's, it's always in his voice, but it's clear that they sort of collaborated to share this story. The ways in which he specifically identifies all of the different legal things that have occurred. Of course, mentions Dred Scott, writing the narrative in 1860, he's able to do that. He mentions the Fugitive Slave Act. Their escape was so sensational that once they were up in Boston and they had, their escape was sort of made public by the abolitionist movement. The slave owners actually petitioned President Fillmore himself, like demanding that the Fugitive Slave Act be enforced and that the Crafts be forced back into slavery. And a vigilance committee in Boston managed to band together and prevent the slave catchers from being able to serve the warrant they had for the Crafts. And so they were then ultimately, they moved up to farther north and then across by ship to England. So those occur. But he also goes into very specific, and not just anecdotal ones, but ones that he actually saw there in Georgia, where a slave owner had freed the slave he had children by, and their children, he had freed them, but then a relative who was white managed to get a court to overturn the will and say he couldn't possibly have meant that, and all of the slaves, all of the children, all of the mother were forced back into slavery. They couldn't use their inheritance from him to purchase their freedom, and so were then sold off. He gives repeatedly the ways in which slave owners give the most horrifying, rationalizations for their behavior. At times to the Crafts on their escape, where one woman talks about how, well, if she didn't sell the slaves and participate in the slave trade, how would she have money to contribute for her missionary causes? He gives others who try and defend the Fugitive Slave Act, and he really tears into their arguments in a very effective way, just as Frederick Douglass did in his narrative earlier in history, about 15 years earlier. Douglass was very good about sort of point by point refuting the arguments of both slave owners and those who supported slavery. Craft does that in a very eloquent and clear way as well. So this is one that I think is absolutely essential reading. It's right up there, I would say, with Douglass, with Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl from Harry Jacobs, with Sojourner Truth. The Craft narrative is one of the most compelling, and it's also short. It's something that could be read in just one day or probably about 2 hours by most readers. So this is one I highly, highly encourage everyone to read, everyone to explore. There are multiple times where Craft references Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and likens their own escape to an escape from the city of destruction to that heavenly city. There are some of the passages that are graphic, that describe parents being separated from their children because of the slave trade, and the horrors that ensue there. That of course bring to mind Beloved by Toni Morrison, an excellent book, one again that I highly recommend. The way in which Ellen Craft was not only passing as white, but passing as a man and a slave owner, of course brings to mind Nella Larsen's fabulous Passing. There are ways in which the narratives that really don't just explore the escape or explore the horrors of slavery, but go into really a rhetorical battle with the lies that are spread, the myths that are spread to sanitize slavery. Of course, bring to mind James Baldwin and his polemics across the 20th century, particularly The Fire Next Time. And then, of course, there are great books that come out of Africa and sort of the decolonization that was occurring there, the liberation and freedom movements there. Two that I think would be particularly strong are A Ride on the Whirlwind by Sipho Sepamla. This one is like written with lightning or written with fire. It's that powerful, and is set in South Africa. And then God's Bits of Woods from Sembène Ousmane, which is from Senegal. And this one deals with a railroad strike in the 1940s and the massive ramifications from that. And again, just feels akin to the passion, the energy, but also this politically astute writing that we find in William and Ellen Craft's Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom. So let me know if you've read this. Let me know if there are other narratives that you think are particularly valuable, as all of them are. But this is certainly one of the ones that I would just feel everybody should be familiar with. So I hope you're doing well. Thank you.